everyone, and welcome back. Today I figured we'd do something a little bit different than my usual video. I quite often do some very casual lives on Instagram, and I get a lot of the same questions, which is great. They're all really good questions. I just figured perhaps I should sort of compile those into a video and share it with everybody who's not able to make it to those lives. Most of them pretty much center around how did I get started in this field? How did I learn how to do all of these things? How did I get interested? What am I specifically interested in? Where am I planning on going with this? Just the general questions of how in the world do you get started in something like what I do? What are the opportunities within the industry, the education options? What is out there? So that's kind of what we're going to be covering today. But much like my lives, we're going to do that while I'm working on a sewing project, because right now I actually have a really big sewing project that I'm working on. In fact, two really big projects. And I don't mean that in the sense of really complex projects. I mean that in physically very large. In fact, they're both about 40 foot long. So very, very big. I am actually working on two flags for the Museum of the American Revolution. I am part of a group that is working on a variety of different flags that would have been flown from ships during the American Revolution, so in the 1770s and 1780s. I specifically have been given two of the pendants, or the very narrow and very long flags that are flown. I have the British one and the French one. These flags are going to actually be flown starting on Flag Day weekend at the Museum of the American Revolution, which is in Philadelphia. So if you are near Philadelphia next month, I highly recommend, if you are able to go check out that exhibit. There are a lot of wonderful people working on this project. I am just one of many, and I've linked a lot of their social medias down below, so that way you can go see everyone else's work on the project as well. And of course, Museum of the American Revolution is linked below as well. So I'll talk a little bit more about them as I go through some of the things that I've done in my history, because I've actually worked with them before on the George Washington Tent Project, which you might have heard me mention at some point in my videos, but we'll get into all of that a little bit more as I go along. So I'm going to pick up my sewing, and we're going to get started with, I guess, the beginnings of me, in a way. It's a little weird to talk about myself in this way, but you guys keep asking these questions, so figured I might as well talk about it. Now, first, to give you guys a little bit of info on the project that I'm working on, so you know what you're looking at. This is the standard British flag portion that we're used to seeing, and this will be attached to a very, very long red piece that I've almost finished. It's all made out of a very loose weave wool bunting, which means that it's not terribly easy to stitch. The whole thing is assembled, though, thankfully, by really quick and easy running stitches, and then these seams are felled down and running stitched again. It's a really simple construction. I am not the one that has come up with all of the information and patterns and all of the research on this particular project. I am just one of many who are working on it. So if you want to know more about the project, I do recommend going and checking out Museum of the American Revolution either digitally or physically to get more information on it. But just so you know what you're seeing while I'm working. So in terms of me, it's kind of funny because I get a lot of questions about where do you begin learning how to sew? And I am really not good at answering that, because the world, one, has changed dramatically in the last 5 to 10 years. And more importantly, I've been sewing since I was 3, at least. I think roughly then. I don't really remember. I just know by the time I was 5, I was sitting next to my mother with my own sewing machine and working away on doll clothes and stuffed animals and all sorts of things that kids would actually like to put together. So sewing has just been a regular part of my life since I actually have any memory. It's true with my family as well. Obviously, my mother knows how to sew. Grandparents did as well. Even my grandfather, who was a surgeon, specifically did cross stitch and all sorts of other hand things like jewelry, so that way he could keep his fingers nimble. So sewing is something that is within my family realm and is a regular thing for me. So I'm not necessarily the best to ask where to start learning to sew, though I do love helping people to learn. In terms of my actual love with sewing clothing, that really picks up about high school point. I not only got interested in fashion and wanted to try making some of my own clothing, but I also really got into theater at that point. And as somebody who knows how to sew and had a parent who knows how to sew, I kind of got volunteered to do a lot of costume stuff for high school theater. So I picked up doing many, many costumes, not only for our big musical productions, for the plays, for the choir, and all sorts of different performances over the years. I just did a whole variety of costumes and scenic design as well. Did a lot of painting, which got me over my fear of heights, I guess, enough. And from there, I realized I wanted to do theater as a profession. So I ended up going off to Ball State University to get my bachelor's in fine arts in technical theater. I originally wanted to actually audition for musical theater. That didn't go well. So I realized that perhaps I should focus more on what I was really happy with and comfortable with, which was technical theater. So I ended up getting my degree from Ball State, which was an amazing experience. If you are looking for an undergraduate school in theater and you are anywhere near there, I highly recommend the program. It was really amazing and very hands-on, which is different than a lot of other undergrad programs for theater where you have graduate students who are the main ones that do all the work. At Ball State, well, we did bring in a lot of professionals and you worked with a lot of the faculty in the productions. A lot of it was focused on being hands-on, and I got to actually design a lot of shows while I was there. And that was when I started to realize that I much preferred working on historical shows and doing all of the research that went into those costumes than I wanted to do modern ones. And though I didn't necessarily get to do a lot of historical productions design-wise while I was there, I just enjoyed making things as well. So when I graduated from there, I graduated straight into the recession. Graduated in 2007. And though we didn't fully understand what was happening yet, at that point in time, it was really hard to find jobs. Things were starting to close up very quickly. So I was not able to find a job in theater like I planned on originally. And I think it was late summer, I was looking around and realized that perhaps Colonial Williamsburg would have some openings. I had visited there as a child when I lived closer by and really enjoyed the place and just like, yeah, that might be interesting. I'd love to do more historical sewing. I would love to learn about history more. I had come to find a refreshed love of history in college that I did not have in high school. I liked history when I was younger, but the history that you learn, at least in the United States, in high school, middle school range, is very much, we're going to learn the date of this battle and the important person that was in it, and repeat, repeat, repeat. So history becomes a bunch of names and dates. I'm not good at those. I'm really bad at remembering those. So I kind of fell out of love with history for a while there. But fortunately, through humanities courses and all sorts of things in college, I really got to love it again. I realized that history could be about the everyday person, their life, how they lived, how they functioned. And so I thought Colonial Williamsburg would be a great way to get to do all of those things. And I was fortunate enough that I managed to get a job working in the costume design center there, which is where all of the clothing is produced. If you don't know Colonial Williamsburg, it is what we call a living history museum. It's out in Virginia on the East Coast, just moving into the South, where it is nice and humid. And it basically covers the American Revolution, the period leading up to it and after it, and just all of the major events there. So while a lot of what goes on there is not acted, it's not people in costumes pretending to be characters. There are those, but the sort of main basis of it is that it has a lot of historical houses that you can tour, and it has a lot of historical trade shops. So the trade shops are actually keeping those trades alive. They're doing the things that would have been done in the 18th century world, things that actually go into the buildings and onto the other employees and get used within the foundation. So those trade shops are absolutely amazing. If you ever get a chance to go there or to any other living history museum that has different trades still running, it really is keeping our knowledge of history alive in a way that would otherwise be lost. And so I was very fortunate that I managed to get a job there, though I wasn't working in clothing, in character, or in the trade shops. I was behind the scenes. The Costume Design Center takes care of the thousands of costume pieces that the employees wear. Most of the work there is done in a more modern sense because you have literally thousands and thousands of pieces coming through. They need to be laundered, they need to be repaired. They can't really be made or maintained all by hand. And though I learned a lot when I started there, I quickly realized that I really wanted to focus on the history portion more so than just the sewing clothing. And so after a couple of years at that place, I sort of branched out on my own and actually ended up doing a business making historic clothing for people. I was lucky in living in Williamsburg. There are a lot of very knowledgeable people, and they are very forthcoming with that knowledge when you ask them, and you are clearly putting the effort forward and trying and wanting to learn things. So I was able to take workshops through Burnley and Trowbridge with a lot of the tradespeople in both tailoring and in gown making and millinery. I was able to also take a workshop on shoemaking for women's 18th century shoes, which is where I picked that up. Brett Walker, fortunately, at the time, he was working at the shoemaker shop there, which does not usually do women's shoes. So he was actually teaching that as a separate trade on his own, and as I realized my feet did not fit into most shoes very easily, that taking that workshop might give me a pair of shoes that would actually fit me. And then I realized I really loved doing shoemaking, that I was that one crazy person out of the workshop that enjoyed the whole thing. And I kept up with it and learned under him for a number of years. I did some work for other people over that time, but ended up moving before I really got into it as like a full business. But during my time at Williamsburg, not only did I take all of those workshops, learn a bunch of skills from the different tradespeople there, and get to try a whole bunch of different things over the years, I did evening programs where I was essentially leading ghost tours or leading tours of the trade shops for school groups. And so again, got to learn a very wide variety of different things about history, about the area, about the 18th century, about all the different trades, get to know a lot of people. And that was a really good experience because it really broadened my concept of how all of this sort of stuff interacts. During that time, I truly and honestly, I applied to a lot of jobs in the trade shops, none of which I got for a good long while. And it was a little frustrating, but I realized I hadn't been there very long. I hadn't done the interpretation that a lot of other people had. Even if I was really good at sewing and had spent a lot of time trying to hone that skill, there were still a lot of other skills that went into that. So that's a great example of don't be discouraged. You never really know where you're going to lead or end up, but it's important to make sure that you have the skills and the knowledge as well done as you can, and the experience and the communication and relationships with people as well, which I know it's all really, that's a lot, I know. But it taught me a lot about what I wanted, because when I first got out there, being young and just out of college, I wanted a specific job or two. There were a few jobs I was like, those are my dream jobs, that's what I want. And quickly I realized that it wasn't always feasible to get that singular dream job. It wasn't up for grabs very often. There was a lot of competition. It just wasn't always going to be a good way to move forward. No matter what I did, it wasn't necessarily going to happen. And so I began to reevaluate what I wanted out of my experience at Williamsburg, which was knowledge and the ability to share it with others. Foreshadowing, that kind of is how I ended up here in the long run. But in the short run, I therefore learned as many things as I could, picked up as many trades as I could, tried to get to know as many people as I could, so that way I could learn more and more. And it worked out for the best. It really did, even though I never ended up with any of those jobs that I had originally been seeking. What I did end up doing, outside of the work at the Costume Design Center and working on my own business, making this stuff for people, and working evening programs, was that I got to pick up a few temporary special jobs. So one of which was working with the Museum of the American Revolution and Colonial Williamsburg to make reproductions of George Washington's marquee tents from the Revolutionary War. Both of his tents survive. They're not the ones that he used through the entire war, but they are the ones that he used at the latter portion of the war. And one of which was the one that he lived in and had his office in. The other was sort of the large dining tent where he would entertain dignitaries and officers and things of that nature. So both of those still survive. They are in different institutions. The Museum of the American Revolution has the smaller living one, and the Smithsonian is the owner of the larger one. And there are some other pieces, such as like an internal piece, that are at different museums all over the place. And we essentially spent, it was supposed to be 3 or 4 months with a pretty large group of us, but it ended up getting expanded because of delays getting the hand-woven fabrics into being more like 6 months, 9 months. Actually, I think it might have been 9 months total for the first project. And then the second tent that we reproduced a couple years later, that was a very short one. That was only about 3 months because we kind of knew what we were doing by that point. But I was really fortunate to get to work on that project. I met a lot of wonderful people. I got to know the people that were starting up the Museum of the American Revolution, because when I started that project, it didn't physically exist in Philadelphia yet. They were still working on actually building the structure, in a sense. So it was a great opportunity to get to work with that museum, all of those people, and get to learn a whole nother trade, because even though I knew how to stitch, tent making is vastly different than any sort of clothing construction. So again, another weird trade that I've picked up. In between those two, I actually also took up a temporary position in the millinery shop. I wanted to work in that shop at some point, so I was grateful for that opportunity. And for those, I guess, that follow along with some of my escapades outside of my own channel, that's also where I really got to know Abby. So Abby was working full-time in the millinery shop at that point in time, and so I was kind of her temporary fill-in while one of the other apprentices was away. And that's how we got to know each other and work with each other and got to realize, hey, we've got a lot in common. Ooh, I really like you. Yeah, I really like you. Oh, you want to be friends? Yeah. So if you ever wondered how that came around, that experience of 9 months working in the millinery shop, which is a difficult job, even under the best of circumstances, just because you're constantly not only trying to produce a lot of sewing and a lot of things that you need to work on and do a lot of research and do presentations and workshops and all sorts of different things, but you're also interpreting to the public every single day. So it's also essentially a full-time customer service job. That was a great experience, not only because I got to work with Abby and work with some other people that I really enjoyed spending a lot of time with and getting to know better, but it also helped me kind of realize that the point of what I really wanted was to have the open opportunity to learn more, to get a better education in this sort of range, and to share that with people, and that I didn't necessarily need to be in one of those shops to do it. And that was also about the time that I was getting ready to move, and I ended up moving out to Omaha, Nebraska for family reasons. And while I was there, I spent a year trying to figure out what in the world I was going to do with my life, because I was no longer surrounded by the 18th century, and that was all I knew. Oh no. Fortunately, down in Lincoln, which is only about an hour south of Omaha, there is the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and they actually have a graduate degree program specifically in fashion history. Who knew? And while I was there, it actually moved over from being just fashion and textile history to being material culture. New faculty came in at the same time that I did, and their area of expertise was really strong in that area. So I had an amazing experience there, which I'm not gonna lie, if you are not from the United States, you may not necessarily realize we tend to think of the East and the West Coasts and other major cities like Chicago or places like that, the ideal places to go to school, where there is more culture in those places, there's more availability of things to do, and that places like the Midwest, where you're kind of in a sea of fields and not much else, that there's not going to be a lot there. But I had actually spent a lot of time when I was younger living in the Midwest, so I knew that there was a lot more to it, thankfully. And UNL was definitely no exception to that. They actually have a really great costume collection in terms of antique pieces. They have a really great program there for not only fashion and fashion merchandising and textile science, it's a massive program for textile science, but also for the history of fashion. And that's tied closely into the history department and the women's and gender studies department. And I had a great 3 years. It was theoretically supposed to be 2 years, but I'd rather learn more and not try and cram it in too fast, I guess. So I spent 3 years there, picking up as much as I could. Bailey, you can stop snoring anytime. I love you, but you are so loud. And I did my thesis there, specifically looking at women's fashion in the 19th century. I focused mostly on shoes, but a lot of it still applied pretty broadly, and the medical concerns that they had throughout the century, and where those concerns came from, how they voiced them, how they viewed women because of them, and how it functioned within society, and eventually just developed into the views that we have of the standard Victorian woman today, and the problems with that. So I know it sounds really complicated. I promise it all makes sense when you read it. I will put a link down to that below. I know I get asked that a lot. Can I read your thesis? And yeah, that's completely free and open to anybody to read if you are crazy enough to want to read that sort of stuff. But I know a lot of you are, just like me. So that was where I got my master's. And from there, because I had a lot of experience with doing shoemaking, specifically with historical shoes, because that was a good portion of my thesis, I had started doing contract work with American Duchess to design a lot of the different shoes. And at that point, Abby had moved out to Reno, out here, to work as the vice president for American Duchess, and it just worked out perfectly. She and I had worked together, had gotten along really well. They needed somebody else to come onto the team, even though I hadn't done technical shoe design before. In that sense, I understood shoes really well, and the historical shoes at that. So I came on to do that for, I think, it was about a year and a half. Again, I got to learn a lot through that experience, that's for sure. And then when Abby really picked up with YouTube stuff and ended up having to go full-time on that, I saw that she was getting to do a lot of the things that I had always wanted to do, where the point was to connect with the community, to help people learn, to provide that information to everybody, make sure it was just available, and it seemed like the right way and the right time to go about it. So I tried making my own, really enjoyed it, and between that and everything else that was going on at the time, I decided to quit and go full-time with YouTube, which is a terrifying prospect, but I have really enjoyed it, even if I am exhausted a lot of the time. But it's worth it. It's worth it every single time that I get to sit down on the Instagram Live and talk with you guys. It's worth it every time I get comments on those videos where people are excited about what I've talked about, or like, oh wow, I never knew that. Oh, that makes such a difference. Oh, I never thought of it that way, or oh, it makes so much more sense now. That's always my point. That's always the goal, is to get those comments. I have a lot of other goals too, but that's become my purpose, and that to me has helped drive me a lot more than having a specific monetary goal or having a specific dream job or a specific project that I want to do or anything really that well defined, because there's too many opportunities that I would have missed if I had not just taken whatever road opened up in front of me and whatever new opportunity I could to learn something new and figure out something new. That has always been the main purpose to me, is just learn new things, share them with others, enjoy the exploration and the learning and the process, and get to know as many people as I can that also enjoy that, because those are the best people to be around. And they don't have to be doing the same thing that you're doing. They just need to also be excited about learning and about exploration of all of those weird things. So those are my, I don't know, life tips in a way, I guess. No matter what field you're planning on going into or changing into, or what point you're at in your life, This is not an easy field to get into. There's not a ton of jobs. There are certainly museums that hire people to do different work like what I'm doing right now, where it's on contract basis. Those are not always the easiest situations. I picked up this one because I had worked with the museum before, because I worked with those people before. I got the first job working with this museum because it was being run by people that I had gotten to know through workshops and through spending time in the shop talking to them. So yes, there is a lot of effort that needs to go into getting into this field, whether you want to be in museum work, whether it's living museums or not, whether you want to do it as a contractor and run your own business, which is exhausting, whether you want to do it on YouTube or any other format. It's not just doing the things repeatedly and learning and showing that process as much as possible, but it is getting to know the community and connections with people, because that really is where the opportunities come up. And I don't want to say it's just luck, because it's not. For a lot of people, you have to be in the right place at the right time, but if you haven't already done the work to actually be at that place, then you won't be there for the opportunity. You won't get that opportunity. And there's a lot of competition for very few jobs within this industry, and they're not always going to be the best in terms of pay. That is the unfortunate nature of the museum world and the unfortunate nature of history and all of those things. That there are some academic jobs and some jobs where you really need a higher education, and you have to go a specific route for that, where you have to make sure that you have chosen the right majors so you get the right experience when it comes to dealing with antique pieces and conservation, or whether you want to focus in more on the actual research portion of it or the making portion of it, or try, like me, to incorporate all of it into one big mass. It's not always the easiest decision to make. And it's not necessarily one that you have to make. If you are interested in this field and you are interested in moving forward in it and getting into this field now at any age, a lot of it just is finding people who are also interested in it and working with different small house museums, visiting as many places as you can, and getting to know as many people as you can, because it is a very tight-knit community in many ways. The Costume Society of America is a great place to start. They have conferences all over the United States, and there are similar organizations in other places as well. I'm just not as familiar with them because I haven't lived in those places. Those sorts of small house museums and small regional museums are usually really excited for you to be there and for you to share what you know and do the research that they don't necessarily have the time to do. I was very fortunate that through my connections that I had with Colonial Williamsburg and the other people that I had met and worked with, that I was able to travel up and down the East Coast a couple summers and actually go to a lot of smaller museums to look at the shoes in their collection. So that's one of those things that I highly recommend doing, no matter where you are, and no matter how much you want to move into this as a serious profession or just as a hobby. That's something that is an option out there for a lot of people, and they don't necessarily realize how accessible a lot of that stuff is if you just, try and get in contact with those places. I guess that's kind of my, life story in a really quick way. So the simple answer is, I've been sewing for a long time. I don't really even know when I started. I've picked up my knowledge of historical sewing and modern sewing from a huge variety of sources. From educational aspects, where I got to do it in school, from workshops, from just talking to people, reading people's blogs online, and from trying things a lot. I mean, most of my modern tailoring just comes from me staring at other people's images online and trying to do it myself. So there's no one way to learn these things. There's no one way to get into this as a job field or as a hobby. There's so many different avenues that everyone has taken to get to this point. Mine is just one of many, but hopefully that helps you understand my background a little bit better and maybe helps you understand where you want to go with your interest and love of fashion history as well.